That brilliant blue bead you are picturing contains no lapis lazuli. It was crafted from common desert sand and magic. This is the story of Egyptian faience, one of the world's first synthetic gems. By the end of this, you will understand the complete alchemical recipe that transformed humble earth into radiant treasure. We will uncover how a crumbly paste became a glassy jewel and why its color was believed to hold the power of life itself. What does it take to turn dust into something divine? This radiant material was a clever deception of the highest order. Faience is not clay, it is something far more ingenious, a glazed non-clay ceramic that stands as a direct ancestor to glass. At its heart is a simple core of crushed quartz sand, mixed with a little natron and some water to form a paste. This sandy body is brittle and crumbly, nothing like the smooth, vitrified quality it would later achieve. The magic happened when an artisan shaped this paste into a bead or an amulet and then coated it with a special slurry. When fired in a kiln, this coating melted into a hard, shimmering glaze, most often in that iconic blue-green shade we call Egyptian blue. So you have this unassuming, sandy interior hidden beneath a luminous, glass-like skin. It was the perfect illusion, a common substance transformed into a jewel. This breakthrough made brilliant color accessible. It brought the turquoise of the sky and the rich green of the Nile's rebirth into the homes and onto the bodies of people from all walks of life. From protective amulets placed on a mummy to the beads in a dancer's hair, faience infused the everyday with a spark of the divine. But how could something so fragile emerge from a kiln with such a perfect, jewel-like finish? The secret lies in a single, self-glazing technique that required no brushes and no human hand to apply the color. That process is where the true alchemy begins. That sandy paste held its own secret recipe for transformation. The Egyptians discovered they could make the glaze appear as if by magic, with no need to paint it on. This self-glazing property must have seemed like pure alchemy. The most common and fascinating method is called efflorescence. Artisans would mix the quartz sand with water, but they also added key ingredients like natron, a natural salt, and a small amount of a copper mineral. This created a wet, moldable paste. As this paste dried, the water within it began to slowly travel outward, moving towards the surface. It carried those dissolved salts and copper particles with it. When the water finally evaporated, it left behind a fine, almost invisible crust of these materials concentrated on the object's skin. To the naked eye, the dried bead just looked a little dusty or chalky. But when it entered the intense heat of the kiln, that dull coating underwent a stunning metamorphosis. The salts and copper melted, fusing together into a continuous, glossy, brilliantly colored glaze that perfectly sheathed the entire object. The glaze literally grew from within the object itself. Now, efflorescence was not the only path. In the application method, a craftsman could dip or brush a pre-made glaze slurry onto the dry object, much like a potter glazing a cup. The cementation method was even more unusual. The unfired objects were buried in a powder made of glazing materials inside a container, then placed in the kiln. During firing, the powder would react, forming a glaze only on the surface of the objects. Each technique produced a slightly different look and feel. But which method did the earliest bead makers truly master? The answer is surprisingly elusive. A technological secret they guarded so well, it remains a subject of intense debate for archaeologists today. That sandy core demanded a very specific kind of earth. The structural skeleton of every faience bead was pure quartz sand. Not all sand was created equal, however. The banks of the Nile provided a uniquely perfect ingredient. This desert sand was exceptionally rich in silica, the essential mineral that forms the very backbone of glass. You could think of it as the flour in a sacred recipe, but raw sand grains are coarse and irregular. To become the body of a jewel, they first had to be transformed. Using simple grinding stones, artisans would patiently crush the sand into an incredibly fine, powdery flour. This was meticulous, labor-intensive work. Each grain needed to be reduced to dust to create a smooth, uniform paste that would hold its shape. This powdered quartz was then carefully sifted through woven sieves, ensuring only the finest particles remained. Any coarse grit was removed. What was left was a soft, pale powder, a blank canvas of pure potential, ready to receive the other, more magical ingredients that would give it color and life. This silica flour provided the strength and the form, but on its own, it was just white dust. It needed a partner to trigger its chemical transformation, a flux to convince the stubborn silica to melt and fuse. That pale, powdery canvas of quartz sand was far from complete. A binding agent was needed, a magical ingredient that could coax this stubborn dust to fuse together under fire. The Egyptians found their answer in natron, a natural salt harvested from the dried beds of desert lakes. This was not a single substance, but a powerful mixture of salts, with soda being the most crucial component. Natron played a dual role in the alchemy of faience. First, it acted as a flux. When heated, the soda in natron dramatically lowers the melting point of the quartz sand. Think of it like salt sprinkled over ice, causing it to melt at a colder temperature. Natron convinced the resilient silica grains to soften, fuse, and bond together at a heat that ancient kilns could actually achieve. Without it, the sand would have remained a crumbly, unfused powder. Second, natron was a vital source of alkali for the glaze itself, helping to create that signature glassy surface. But there was a third, silent partner in this recipe, often present without the artisans even realizing it. Lime, or calcium carbonate, frequently existed as a natural impurity within the desert sand. While natron encouraged fusion, lime provided stability. It strengthened the final structure, preventing the faience object from warping or becoming too brittle in the kiln's intense heat. This humble trio of quartz, natron, and lime formed the holy trinity of faience. Yet, for all its structural genius, the material still lacked one thing: the soul that would give it a voice and a vibrant, living color. That soul was a metal, and its story is one of trade, power, and a quest for the perfect shade of the heavens. The soul of Egyptian blue was a metal, copper. This was the final, magical ingredient that transformed a pale, sandy body into a jewel echoing the sky and the river. Egyptians sourced their copper from brilliant green minerals like malachite, or even from the scrapings and filings of solid copper objects. These materials were painstakingly ground into a fine, colorful powder using stone tools. This powder was then mixed into the core paste or included in the glazing slurry, depending on the technique. The true transformation, however, happened inside the kiln. As the temperature soared, the copper particles dissolved into the molten glaze. They did not simply sit there. They chemically bonded, their atoms dispersing evenly to act as a powerful colorant. The specific shade that emerged, from a deep turquoise to a brilliant sky blue, was a delicate dance of chemistry. It depended on the amount of copper used, the precise mix of other ingredients, and even the level of oxygen inside the kiln during firing. A slightly different atmosphere could mean the difference between a rich blue and a muted green. This was not a random color. For the Egyptians, this specific blue-green hue was deeply symbolic. It represented the life-giving waters of the Nile, the lush vegetation that grew along its banks, and the divine, protective sky arched overhead. To wear a faience bead was to carry a piece of this fertile, living power. But how did these fragile, jewel-like objects survive the brutal trial by fire? The final challenge was the kiln itself, a volatile environment where a single mistake could shatter weeks of work. The final recipe was a powder waiting for its liquid catalyst. An artisan would carefully combine that fine quartz flour with the white natron salts, a dash of lime, and the precious green copper powder. All these dry ingredients were meticulously blended together in a shallow bowl, their pale colors swirling into a uniform mixture. Only then came the water, added slowly and deliberately. This was a moment of profound skill. Too much water, and the paste would become a soupy slurry, unable to hold a shape. Too little, and it would remain a crumbly dust, fracturing at the slightest touch. The goal was a specific, pliable consistency, something like a stiff modern-day modeling clay. The craftsperson would knead the mixture with their hands, feeling for the perfect balance, working it until every single grain of quartz and every particle of copper was evenly distributed. This was the birth of the faience body, a homogeneous, slightly cool and damp paste, now alive with potential. It was a material that held the memory of the desert and the promise of the sky, all bound together by the Nile's own water, ready for the artist's touch to give it a permanent form. With the paste prepared, the artist's hands turned it into a form of lasting power. They pressed the cool, damp mixture into pre-made molds, often carved from clay or stone. These molds were the ancient equivalent of a factory stamp, allowing for the creation of perfectly uniform beads by the dozens. A single craftsman could produce hundreds of identical shapes in a single session, a crucial innovation for feeding Egypt's immense appetite for this sacred material. The variety of forms was astonishing. There were simple, elegant discs and long, slender cylinders, perfect for threading into long, cascading necklaces. Then came the melon-shaped beads, their surfaces ribbed like the fruit they were named for, catching the light in a play of shadow and shine, but the true masterpieces were the amulets. These molds carved deep impressions for the sacred eye of Horus, a symbol of protection and healing. They shaped the form of the scarab beetle, a creature representing transformation and the sun's daily rebirth. Each tiny molded figure was destined to become a powerful talisman, a piece of divine armor for the living and the dead. This process of molding made the profound accessible. It allowed a common artisan to replicate sacred symbols with precision, embedding powerful magic into objects that could be worn by anyone. But how did these soft, molded forms survive the kiln's inferno without cracking or losing their perfect detail? The answer lies in a final, invisible ingredient, a secret of patience that occurred long before the fire was ever lit. Molds were not the only path to perfection. For simpler forms or truly unique pieces, the artist's own hands became the ultimate tool. They would pinch a small lump of the prepared paste and begin to roll it gently between their palms. This simple, rhythmic motion could coax the material into a perfect sphere, a process that felt as ancient and fundamental as the earth itself. Other times, they pressed and rolled the bead against a flat stone slab, smoothing its surface until it was flawlessly round. This hand modeling created beads with a subtle, organic character, each one bearing the faint, unique impression of its maker's touch, but perhaps the most ingenious technique was reserved for creating hollow beads. An artisan would take a slender stalk of red or a hollow piece of straw, then carefully wrap a thin sheet of the faience paste around it. They would roll it on their palm, sealing the seam and creating a perfect, lightweight tube. This central core of plant material was a temporary scaffold. When the bead was placed into the kiln, the intense heat would not affect the glaze, but it would completely incinerate the red inside. The organic stalk would burn away to ash, leaving behind a perfectly hollow, cylindrical bead, its interior as smooth and empty as a secret chamber. This method produced beads that were not only beautiful, but also remarkably light, allowing for elaborate collars and necklaces that did not weigh heavily upon the wearer. From the uniform perfection of molded amulets to the unique charm of hand-rolled spheres and the clever engineering of hollow tubes, the shaping of faience was an art of both mass production and intimate craftsmanship. Yet these soft, freshly shaped forms were incredibly fragile, mere damp sculptures that could crumble back to dust with a single careless touch. Before they could face the fire, they had to undergo a slow, patient transformation, a quiet period of waiting where the true magic of the glaze began to stir from within. This quiet drying phase was the most delicate moment in the bead's entire life. Those soft, newly shaped forms could not simply be baked in the sun. A single day of direct heat would have been a disaster, causing the outside to harden into a rigid shell while the interior remained wet and soft. As the core continued to dry and shrink, it would pull against that hardened skin, creating immense internal stress. The result was inevitable: a network of tiny cracks or a complete catastrophic fracture, shattering weeks of meticulous work in an instant. To prevent this, artisans placed their creations in shaded, well-ventilated spaces, perhaps under a simple cloth awning or inside a cool, mud brick storeroom. Here, the beads rested for days, sometimes even longer, losing their moisture at an almost imperceptibly slow pace. This was not passive waiting, it was a period of active, invisible transformation. As the water within the paste began its gradual journey outward, it carried the dissolved natron and copper particles with it. This slow migration was the heart of the efflorescence process. When the water finally reached the surface and evaporated into the dry air, it could not take the salts and minerals with it. These ingredients were left behind, deposited as a fine, crystalline film that coated every contour of the bead. To an observer, the object would have looked dull and dusty, perhaps even a little disappointing, its vibrant potential completely hidden beneath a chalky white veil. Yet this unassuming powder was the future glaze in waiting, a skin of pure potential. The bead was now primed for its final, fiery rebirth, holding its breath before the storm. The kiln was the final, decisive crucible for these fragile creations. Ancient Egyptian kilns were marvels of simple, effective design, typically built from mud brick and operating on an updraft principle. A fire chamber at the bottom would be stoked with wood or charcoal, and the hot gases and flames would rush upward through the chamber where the artifacts were placed before escaping out of an opening in the roof. This design created a consistent, enveloping heat, but that direct flame was a deadly threat to the delicate beads. A single lick of fire or a falling piece of ash could mar a glazed surface forever, leaving black scars or causing the glaze to blister. To shield their work, the artisans used protective containers called saggers. These were simple ceramic pots, bowls, or lidded boxes, unglazed and sturdy. The carefully dried beads, each one coated in its invisible, powdery glaze, were nestled inside these saggers, often separated by a layer of clean sand or crushed quartz to prevent them from sticking together in the heat. The saggers were then stacked strategically on shelves within the kiln's main chamber, creating a protective barrier between the objects and the raw fury of the fire. This was a careful, deliberate process, a ritual of placement that could mean the difference between a trove of brilliant jewels and a pile of useless, soot-stained fragments. Every bead was now entombed within its ceramic armor, waiting in the growing darkness for the fire to be lit. The stage was set. All that was needed was the spark that would begin the final, alchemical dance between earth and flame. The fire was lit, and the temperature inside the kiln began its slow, relentless climb. It did not need the searing heat of a copper smelter. The magic of faience happened at a comparatively modest range, between 800 and 1,000 degrees Celsius. This was a carefully measured warmth, a gentle coaxing rather than a violent assault. At this precise thermal sweet spot, the powdery crust of salts and copper on the bead's surface would melt into a smooth, liquid glass, while the sandy quartz core beneath it softened just enough to fuse together, yet not so much that it would slump and lose its shape. It was a breathtakingly narrow window for success, but the temperature was only half the story. The very air inside the kiln held the final command over the bead's ultimate color. The atmosphere was the unseen artist's hand. In most firings, the kiln was kept rich with oxygen, an oxidizing atmosphere. This allowed the copper particles to interact freely with the air, producing those legendary shades of turquoise, deep blue, and vibrant green that sang of the Nile and the heavens. This was the classic Egyptian palette, yet, if the air supply was restricted, something entirely different could occur. A reducing atmosphere, starved of oxygen, could force the copper to express a different side of its personality, sometimes yielding deep reds or even muted blacks. While these colors were far rarer in faience, their existence proves the Egyptians understood this fundamental chemical dance. They knew that controlling the fire meant more than just controlling the heat, it meant mastering the very breath of the kiln itself. The transformation was complete, but how could such delicate, glassy objects, born from a crumbly paste, survive for thousands of years in the harsh Egyptian desert? The final mystery lies not in their creation, but in their incredible defiance of time itself. Inside the protective saggers, a silent spectacle was unfolding. That dull, chalky film coating each bead began to tremble as the heat intensified. It was a slow, viscous flow, a liquid skin consuming every contour and curve. The white powder seemed to vanish, replaced by a shimmering, translucent coat that captured the fire's light. In mere moments, a bead that had looked like a lump of dried mud was reborn as a radiant jewel, its surface now a hard, glassy mirror reflecting the world. This was the climax of the entire alchemical process, the moment where common earth was permanently transfigured into a vessel of light and color. An artisan peering into the kiln at this precise instant would have seen the magic made real, watching as an entire batch of objects simultaneously ignited with inner life. The transformation was not just visual, it was symbolic. The dullness of mortality had been shed, replaced by the brilliant, imperishable sheen of the divine. This was the birth of a treasure, a piece of the sky and the river made solid, ready to be worn for a lifetime and beyond. The kiln's heat faded slowly over a day, perhaps two, until the bricks were merely warm to the touch. Unsealing the chamber was a moment of profound anticipation. An artisan would carefully lift the lid of a sagger, the fine dust of cooled ash swirling in the air. Reaching inside, their fingers would not find the crumbly paste they had loaded days before, but something cool, hard, and smooth. Each bead was lifted into the light, its true character revealed for the first time. This was the moment of judgment, where weeks of labor met their final verdict. A perfect bead was a small miracle, its glaze even and brilliant, its color a deep, luminous echo of the sacred Nile. But the kiln was an unpredictable partner. Sometimes, the heat had been too fierce, causing tiny bubbles of gas to form within the quartz body, a flaw known as bloating that left the surface pitted and rough. If the cooling happened too quickly, a web of fine cracks, called crazing, could spread across the glaze like a spider's web. An uneven glaze might leave dull, sandy patches exposed, a failure of the efflorescence magic. These imperfect beads were the seconds of the ancient workshop, yet in a culture that prized both beauty and practicality, very little was ever truly wasted. A bead with a small crack on one side could be strung with that flaw turned inward, hidden against the wearer's skin. Severely damaged pieces might be crushed back into a coarse powder, ready to be incorporated into a new batch of paste, their essence given a second chance at perfection. Even in failure, the material was teaching its makers, each flawed batch whispering secrets about temperature and mixture that would lead to a more brilliant harvest next time. A perfect bead is useless without a hole. This final step of piercing the jewel was an act of pure nerve and precision. The tool of choice was a simple bow drill, a device of elegant efficiency. A craftsman would fix a slender, pointed drill bit, often made of sharp flint or a sliver of hardened copper, into a wooden shaft. A cord was then wrapped around this shaft and attached to a small bow. By moving the bow back and forth, the craftsman could spin the drill bit at a high, controlled speed. The bead itself was held firmly in place, perhaps nestled in a block of wood or secured in the craftsman's other hand. Then, with steady pressure, the whirring tip would bite into the glassy surface, sending a fine, glittering dust into the air. The real genius, however, lay in the technique. Drilling straight through a tiny, brittle bead from one side to the other was a recipe for disaster. The pressure would almost certainly cause the backside to chip and splinter as the drill bit broke through. So the artisans devised a brilliant solution. They would drill exactly halfway through from one side, then carefully flip the bead over and drill from the opposite side, meeting the first hole perfectly in the center. This method distributed the stress, preserving the bead's delicate integrity. The skill required for this is almost unimaginable. To guide a primitive drill through a sphere no larger than a peppercorn and hit a target you cannot even see required a lifetime of practiced feel. A single misjudgment, a fraction of a millimeter off, and the two tunnels would fail to connect, leaving the bead beautiful but functionally dead, a jewel with no voice. This final physical act of piercing completed the bead's journey, transforming it from a mere ornament into a connector of lives, ready to be strung into a story that could last for millennia. Even the most brilliantly glazed bead might receive one last, intimate touch. Once cooled and removed from their protective saggers, the beads were inspected with a critical eye. While the fired glaze itself was a hard, glassy finish, the surface could sometimes have a slight roughness or a faint, matte texture from the kiln's atmosphere. To correct this, an artisan might take a perfectly smooth, water-worn pebble or a piece of coarse, dry cloth. With gentle, circular motions, they would burnish the surface of the bead, not to remove material, but to compact and smooth the outermost layer of the glaze itself. This careful polishing would amplify the inherent luster, making the color appear deeper and more vibrant, as if drawing the light from within the jewel. For the vast majority of faience, the glaze was the complete and final statement, yet on rare, special occasions, an artist might add a final flourish after the firing was complete. Using a fine brush and a thick, pigmented paste, they could paint intricate details directly onto the cool, hard surface. Imagine a simple blue scarab amulet, its main body glowing from the kiln, now receiving hand-painted black lines to define the delicate separation of its wing cases or the segments of its legs. This secondary painting was far more fragile than the permanent, fused glaze beneath it. Over centuries, this painted layer has often worn away, leaving behind only the ghost of its original design, a faint trace of the artisan's final, fleeting signature. This combination of the eternal and the ephemeral, the alchemical color born in fire and the delicate detail applied by hand, shows a culture that understood beauty on every scale, from the monumental to the minutely personal. While that iconic turquoise was the soul of faience, it was far from the only voice in its chorus of color. Egyptian artisans were master chemists, painting with a palette drawn from the very earth around them. To achieve a deep, solemn black or a mysterious purple, they turned to the mineral manganese. When ground and added to the paste, manganese created a stark, powerful contrast, often used for the pupils in sacred eyes or the hieroglyphs on a tiny amulet. For the warm, earthy tones of the desert, they used iron oxides. These common minerals, the same ones that give the desert sands their rich, reddish-brown hue, could produce a spectrum from pale yellows and ochres to deep, rusty browns. But their mastery over their signature blue was perhaps most impressive. By simply adjusting the amount of copper in the mixture, they could command the color to shift. A smaller amount of copper, combined with the right kiln conditions, yielded a soft, almost ethereal sky blue. A heavier, more generous dose of the mineral would produce a deep, saturated turquoise that seemed to hold the very essence of the Nile. The kiln's atmosphere was their final brushstroke. That same copper, fired in a kiln with less oxygen, could surprise the maker by emerging not as blue, but with a distinct, reddish-green tinge. This vibrant spectrum was no accident. It was a deliberate chemical language where every shade from sunny yellow to midnight black carried a specific meaning, a silent word in a conversation between the wearer and the divine. This vibrant spectrum of color was destined for the human form. The primary stage for a faience bead was not a dusty shelf, but a living, breathing body. They were strung together by the thousands to create magnificent, shimmering collars known as wesek. These were not delicate necklaces. A broad collar was a symphony of shape and color, a dense tapestry of beads that could cover a person's chest and shoulders from collarbone to breastbone. Imagine the soft, percussive sound of countless glassy beads rustling against each other with every movement. These collars were central to both daily elite fashion and sacred funeral rites. But the adornment did not stop at the neck. Dancers and noblewomen wore girdles, intricate belts of faience beads that hung low on the hips, their sway and chime accentuating the rhythm of a dance or a ceremonial walk. Bracelets and anklets completed the ensemble, turning the entire body into a canvas of luminous, moving color. The true social revolution of faience, however, lay in its accessibility. While the pharaohs and viziers had their pieces crafted from solid gold and inlaid with lapis lazuli, the average Egyptian could now possess something that captured the same divine essence. A farmer's wife might own a single string of simple blue disc beads, a humble yet powerful connection to the gods. A soldier could be buried with an amulet of the god Bes, crudely molded in faience but radiating the same protective power as a jeweled version in a royal tomb. Faience democratized beauty and sanctity. It allowed an entire civilization to literally wear its beliefs, to drape the colors of life, death, and rebirth directly onto their skin. This was a magic available to nearly everyone, a piece of the sky that even a common hand could hold. A faience bead was far more than mere decoration. It was a vessel for the fundamental forces of the universe. That specific blue-green hue was a direct echo of the Nile's life-giving floodwaters, the very source of Egypt's fertility and abundance. It mirrored the lush green vegetation that sprouted along the riverbanks and reflected the vast, protective dome of the sky arching overhead. To where this color was to carry a piece of the cosmos, a physical fragment of life, death, and rebirth, this deep symbolism is what transformed faience from a clever craft into a sacred medium. Its very composition reinforced this power. The way it began as a crumbly, earth-like paste and was reborn in fire as a shining, imperishable jewel perfectly mirrored the Egyptian belief in resurrection and eternal life. The material itself was believed to be magically charged, holding within its glassy skin the essence of life and divine protection. This is why faience was the preferred substance for amulets, those small charms placed on mummies and worn by the living. An amulet's power did not come from its artistic quality alone, but from the potent combination of its sacred shape and the magical material from which it was made. A simple blue disc bead could ward off the evil eye, but a bead carved into the shape of a god or a sacred symbol became a concentrated battery of divine energy. The Eye of Horus or Wedjat, fashioned from faience, was not just a representation of healing and protection. It was thought to be a living, active conduit for those very qualities, its blue-green body radiating safety for the wearer. The scarab beetle, another common faience amulet, encapsulated the entire cycle of the sun and the promise of rebirth, its form and material singing the same eternal song. How do you separate the magic from the object when the object itself is born from such potent, earthly alchemy? This sacred material found its ultimate purpose not on the dancing body, but on the still, wrapped form of the deceased. In the tomb, faience beads were transformed from adornment into armor for the soul's perilous journey. One of the most stunning applications was the beaded net, an intricate garment of protection. Artisans would thread countless tiny faience beads, often in blue and green, onto long linen cords. These cords were then meticulously knotted into a vast, shimmering net designed to be draped directly over the linen-wrapped mummy. From a distance, it would have looked like a second skin of captured light, a glistening web enveloping the body, but this was far more than a decorative shroud. Each knot and every bead was a calculated act of spiritual defense. The net was believed to create a magical barrier, a shield of divine energy that trapped malevolent forces and prevented them from reaching the vulnerable deceased within. In other burials, beads were sewn directly onto the burial linen itself, painstakingly stitched into patterns that mirrored the very constellations or formed the shapes of powerful gods. Imagine the final preparation of a loved one, the careful placement of each radiant bead onto the cloth that would be their eternal garment. A simple disc sewn over the heart could represent the eye of a god, forever watching over them. A row of melon beads along the spine might symbolize the strength and resilience needed for rebirth. These objects were functionally and spiritually vital. They were not grave goods left in a box. They were integrated directly into the mummy's sacred architecture. They served as a permanent, unblinking guard, a suit of light engineered to ensure the deceased's safe passage and triumphant rebirth in the world to come. The air in the workshop would have smelled of dust and damp earth. Picture a semi-open space, shaded by a simple roof of raid matting, its walls little more than low mud brick partitions meant to break the wind, not seal out the world. Light would have streamed in, illuminating clouds of fine, white powder hanging in the air. In one corner, the rhythmic, grating sound of grinding stones was constant as a worker patiently reduced glistening quartz pebbles into a soft, pale flower. Nearby, another artisan knelt beside a shallow stone pallet, their hands deep in a bowl, feeling for the perfect texture in a batch of cool, blue-tinged paste. This was not a factory, but a sanctuary of applied chemistry. The true masters of this space were not just artists, they were inheritors of a sacred recipe. Their knowledge was a living thing, passed not from a book, but from a senior craftsperson's hands to an apprentice's watching eyes. They understood that the white sand from one part of the riverbank behaved differently than that from another. They knew precisely how the natron from a particular desert lake would affect the melt. They could judge the dryness of a bead not with a timer, but with a touch, sensing the exact moment it was ready for its fiery transformation. Their workspace was organized around this intimate process. There were designated areas for the brute force of crushing raw materials, separate from the delicate art of mixing the paste. Shelves held rows of drying beads, each one resting on a bed of clean sand, safe from the direct sun. A collection of worn molds, carved with the shapes of gods and goddesses, sat carefully arranged, their sacred impressions waiting to be filled. This was a place where patience was the most vital tool, and every step, from the first crush of stone on sand to the final judgment of a cooled bead, was a link in an unbroken chain of alchemical tradition. These silent workshops eventually fell to ruin, their secrets buried for millennia under the desert sands. It is only through the careful work of archaeologists that we can walk through their doors again. At sprawling sites like the city of Amarna and the pyramid complex of Lisht, excavations have uncovered the physical evidence of this ancient industry. These are not just places where faience was used, They are the literal factories where it was born. The most telling finds are the kilns themselves. Archaeologists have uncovered the low, circular foundations of mud brick furnaces, their interiors still stained with soot and vitrified from the intense, repeated heat. Scattered around them, like the discarded shells of a strange harvest, are the failures and the waste. There are lumps of fused, glassy material called fritz, the result of a batch that overheated and melted into a solid mass. Piles of cracked and bloated beads, rejected by some ancient quality controller, tell silent stories of a firing that went wrong. Most precious of all are the rare finds of unfired beads. These are the objects that never made it to the kiln, their sandy paste preserved exactly as an artisan left them, still holding the faint greenish tint of raw copper. To hold one is to freeze time at the very moment of potential, just before the magic of fire would have sealed its fate. This archaeological record does more than just confirm our theories, it adds stunning detail. The layout of these workshops reveals an efficient, almost industrial process. Areas for raw material preparation, with grinding stones still in place, are separate from the molding and drying areas. This physical proof shows us that the production of faience was not some scattered, occasional craft, but a highly organized, large-scale industry that fueled an empire's desire for divine color. The very earth of these sites is a library, its pages written in shattered kiln bricks and beads that never saw the light of day. The brilliance of Egyptian faience could not be contained within the Nile Valley. This was a technology so revolutionary it began to travel, carried along ancient trade routes by merchants and artisans. The knowledge of how to turn sand into jewel slowly seeped into neighboring cultures across the Mediterranean and the Near East. The Minoans on Crete adopted the technique, creating their own distinct, vibrant pendants and seals. In Mesopotamia, craftsmen experimented with the recipes, producing faience objects that reflected their own artistic tastes. This was not a simple copy, but a cultural conversation, with each civilization adding its own voice to the original Egyptian formula. The spread of faience was the spread of an idea, the powerful notion that humanity could master the elements to create its own gems, a concept that would ultimately change the world. This very mastery over glazing and high-temperature chemistry was the essential precursor to an even greater innovation. Egyptian faience, with its glassy skin and sandy core, represents the direct technological ancestor of true glass. The craftsmen who learned to control the melt of a glaze were only one small step away from a monumental discovery. What if they used more flux and higher heat, abandoning the sandy core entirely to create a material that was pure, homogeneous glass? This is precisely what happened. The same workshops that produced faience beads began to experiment, slowly refining their process. They discovered that by melting silica, natron, and lime together without a solid quartz body, they could produce a viscous liquid that could be cast, wound, or core formed. The first glass vessels were expensive luxuries, but their origin story is written in the kilns of the faience makers. Every brilliant Egyptian glass jar owes its existence to the humble, self-glazing bead. That first spark of alchemy, the moment an artisan saw a dusty paste emerge from the fire as a blue jewel, ignited a chain of innovation that would eventually give the world transparent glass, windows, and lenses. The legacy of faience is not just in the amulets we find in museums, but in the very way we see our world today. Modern experimenters have tried to recreate this ancient magic with strikingly mixed results. These experimental archaeologists gather pure quartz sand, source natural salts, and grind copper minerals into a fine green powder, just as the ancients did. They mix the paste with the same careful patience and shape their beads by hand, yet even with the entire chemical recipe laid bare, the final step remains a formidable challenge. Controlling the primitive kiln is an art form in itself. One team might open their kiln to find a beautiful, glossy blue bead, a perfect twin to an artifact in a museum case. Another group, using an identical paste recipe, will find only a crumbly, sintered lump, its color dull and its surface cracked. The difference of a few dozen degrees or a slight shift in the kiln's airflow is enough to separate triumph from total failure. This inconsistency reveals the true genius of the Egyptian craft. It was not just about knowing the ingredients, it was about possessing a deep, intuitive understanding of fire. An ancient master could likely sense the perfect firing temperature by the color of the embers or the sound of the wind over the kiln's vent. They held knowledge that was never written down, a physical wisdom passed from teacher to apprentice over generations. Their consistent success was not a happy accident. It was the product of a refined, living tradition that turned a volatile chemical process into a reliable, sacred craft. From a handful of common desert sand to a jewel that captured the light of the heavens, this was an alchemy of pure ingenuity. The complete journey of an Egyptian faience bead is a testament to a civilization that saw potential in the most humble materials. They took quartz, ground it to dust, and bound it with desert salts. They infused it with the vibrant soul of copper and, through a masterful understanding of fire, coaxed a brilliant, glassy skin to bloom from within. This was not merely a technical process, it was a profound act of transformation that mirrored their deepest beliefs about life, death, and rebirth. These beads were more than simple ornaments, they were wearable pieces of the cosmos, a democratic magic that allowed everyone from a farmer to a pharaoh to carry the colors of the Nile and the sky. The true legacy of faience is not just in the beautiful objects that survive, but in the brilliant, artistic spirit they represent, a spirit that could look at a pile of sand and see a jewel waiting to be born. We would love to hear which part of this ancient process amazed you the most. Was it the self-glazing magic of efflorescence, the nerve-wracking finality of the kiln, or the incredible symbolism woven into every tiny bead? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to join us as we continue to unravel the deepest mysteries of the ancient world.